Now I give the floor to Mr. Czarnecki, who will be speaking on behalf of the ECR.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the Latin maxim pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink, is applicable when we talk about Bahrain, because we are also talking about Europe, about European companies which make money to the violation of human rights. Bahrain is like a mirror in which Europe can see its own reflection. I would also like to express solidarity with our colleagues bloggers who in Bahrain have completely different conditions for practicing blogging than in Europe. So I believe that we need to stand behind human rights in Bahrain as a factor for developing a civil society there.
Dziękuję bardzo. Mr. Slitter and the Greens.
Thank you very much, President. In 1848, do we remember when the European revolutions shook people awake? There was a spring, but then there was internal repression. The kings returned to their thrones at the end of the year. Let us not allow the Arab Spring to suffer the same fate. We need to support the people in these countries. People are being thrown into prison. There are arbitrary arrests. People are being prevented from proffering medical support, and people being subject to torture. The Hippocratic Oath is a 2,000-year-old oath to help people. We see thousands of Saudi Arabian soldiers helping the Bahraini authorities to exert repression. Other regimes are doing similar things. We have to stop all brutal exports. We have to put conditions on those countries in Europe and firms who are exploiting the situation to make money. We have to get rid of our dependence on oil. This is what gives these dictators control over their countries and allows them to do what they're doing. We have to make sure that European companies are not exploiting that to their own ends.
Thank you. Now, Madame Bergiat and Gue.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I welcome the fact that we are finally adopting a resolution specifically about Bahrain. The Arab Spring that began in February, we're seeing this spread to Bahrain. It, of course, has also spread to Yemen. Hundreds of peaceful demonstrators have been murdered, tortured or arrested. Repression has also been extended to caring professionals and doctors whose only crime was to dare to lend succor to the wounded. Trade unionists and lawyers are continually harassed. We're seeing kangaroo courts condemn people in 7 minutes and death sentences passed, and the very least we can say is that the international community was slow to act and that its condemnation of this repression was limp-wristed, to say the least. There's been, in fact, with the thousands of Saudi soldiers are on Bahraini soldiers, it's difficult to emphasize how timorous the resolution is. There's no condemnation of Saudi military presence. We express serious concern. That's really very weak. And of course the silence from the Council is deafening. How's Lady Ashton going to develop her strategy with these double standards? She says she wants to work on the basis of facts. Well, it's time to act, to react, and to help the Bahraini people.
Merci. Pán Paška.
Thank you.
Svobody a demokracie.
Ďakujem za slovo, vážený pán predsedajúci. Arabská jar, ktorá začala na severe.
Thank you very much. When the Arab Spring began in the north of Africa, several countries in North Africa were influenced by this, and the unrest began in Bahrain as well. And the King of Bahrain decided that the protests should not be allowed to develop. And I think that it's possible that the security forces of the Gulf Cooperation Council were brought in, but the procedures were very problematic. They acted against doctors and medics who were only doing their duty. There was repression against protesters and other people, and several Arab leaders wanted to demonstrate their power. The wise ones choose dialogue with the citizens, and they offer solutions and they offer dialogue or negotiation. I think that this is the sort of course which should be followed in Bahrain too. Thank you.
A též děkujem a předávám slovo panu Obermayerovi. Obermayer, bitte.
Mr. Obermeyer.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you, President. With the Arab Spring, we saw peaceful demonstrations in Bahrain on a regular basis, but the regime, unfortunately, was very brutal in its reactions and crushed these peaceful demonstrations. And the first people who were condemned to 15 years in prison for incitement to hatred against the state is also an unfortunate story. There is an obligation under international humanitarian aid, and the state of Bahrain has signed up to the Geneva Convention, for example, but it's not just Bahrain, it's Saudi Arabian troops are on soil on their territory putting down these demonstrations. We have to make sure that a democratization process can be helped along its way, but we hope at the same time that Sharia is not brought in through the back door.
Madam Korhola is our next speaker.
Kiitos, arvoisa puhemies. Arabikevään
Thank you, Mr. President. The demonstrators calling for democracy as part of the Arab Spring have ended up in prison. Thousands of, or very many doctors and healthcare professionals have been imprisoned and were accused of undermining the regime, and all they were doing was acting ethically and helping the wounded. Now, for a long time there's been repression in this country, so it's not at all surprising that the repressed Sunni majority is rising up against the monarchy. There's tough censorship in the country, particularly on the internet, and any protests have been violently repressed. Bahrain has to respect human rights, engage in dialogue and do what is necessary to give way to social change as required. The real effects of Arab Spring can only be analyzed after that.
Un raport dat publicității luni de către mai multe organizații pentru apărarea drepturilor omului.
Several human rights organizations in different reports have pointed out that protest movements during the Arab Spring in many countries have led to repression being reinforced, and Bahrain is the most worrying case because there the reform movement has been brutally repressed. The army was brought in to act against the protesters, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries also participated in repression. There have been many deaths and many injured people, and repression has continued in a brutal way. Human rights activists are thrown into prison. Doctors and other activists are arbitrarily arrested and sentenced, and the press is being censored. Access to the internet is restricted. The European Union has condemned violence and repression in Bahrain repeatedly, but there has been no change in the situation. So I think that we need to exert pressure so that political prisoners can be released, and so that doctors can no longer be sentenced on political or religious grounds. Bahrain must put an end to the death penalty. and convert it into a different type of penalty and completely give up these brutal measures. And weapons exports should be suspended until the Commission tables its report. Thank you.
Catch the eyes, and I can see Mr. Mikolášek would like to speak. Pane poslanče, prosím.
Ďakujem pekne, pán predsedajúci. Vážené...
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner. The so-called Arab Spring is something that gave rise to movements in Tunisia, Syria, Yemen, but also in Bahrain. And we're extremely shocked that in this country as well, this regime has brutally cracked down on these demonstrators, people who are fighting for human rights and freedom. They are people we deem to be self-evident here in the West. We're very shocked that medics, nurses and doctors are being condemned to custodial sentences as much as for 15 years simply for meeting the demands of their oaths that they've taken and treating people who would have died if they hadn't been helped. I'm also shocked that the death penalty still exists in Bahrain and that this is a tool that's being used against opponents to the regime. I hope that this resolution will certainly help the Bahrainis to find their way to freedom. Thank you.
Repo is next.
Arvoisa puhemies, Bahrainin tilanne näyttää todella
Mr. President, the situation in Bahrain is looking increasingly bleak. The authorities are using heavy-handed and violent methods to suppress peaceful demonstrators who are just calling for democratic change. Particularly worrying is the fate of healthcare professionals and doctors who have been sentenced for up to 15 years in prison. All they were doing was just attended the wounding, as is ethically demanded of them by their profession. Their sentences must be quashed. They should be allowed to exercise freely. Military tribunals do not comply with the basic rules of justice. The arrests and pretexts used to arrest adults and even children have to be denounced. Bahrain has to respect international rights and international obligation, and